Welcome to my third installment of Baptist Orthodoxy. Today I want to talk about the Eucharist, priests, and bishops. To get there, I wanted to mention how I view history and the importance of primary sources. So the closer you can get to the actual individual who's provided the information or to the event that actually happened, I think the more accurate your information is going to be. I've seen some arguments about, how good secondary sources can be because they've had a chance to go ahead and talk with numerous individuals who were there so that they can get, a group of perspectives. But still, I think it would be better, instead of getting that secondary source who has interviewed several individuals, to go ahead and interview those several individuals yourself. Hence the reason I think we're given 4 different Gospels, so that we can see the perspective of the apostles from the 4 different angles that each of them go ahead and present their information from. Or also from someone who knew an apostle, such as Luke or Mark. Therefore, any sort of information that we get, I think the closer we can get to the actual source, the better. For example, if you have a professor who has, given a class and you get a copy of his lecture notes, it'd be far better to actually be in his class and hear him give it, particularly with questions and stuff like that may come from the class that he answers, which would help clarify any notes that are in the in his class notes, right? So that's one of the things that I think makes the game telephone so fun, is particularly if you have a whole lot of people. You could provide information to the first person who passes it down and then see how it changed once you get through all the individuals. Now then, that doesn't always work, particularly if everybody's careful and if you don't have all that many people. But when you start looking at history, right, that's a whole lot of people and a whole lot of time for information to go through. And if you're someone who wants to go ahead and pass down a given tradition, right, that seems to be a bad word, but I mean, that's what it is. Even here today in the modern era, you have traditions that have been passed down from either John Calvin or Zwingli or Luther or whoever else, right, in the Reformation. So tradition in and of itself is not a bad thing. It depends on what it's based on. But when your tradition is based on words that are written, right, and then words that were spoken, and then you combine the two, that's how you pass down information. Particularly when it's like, oh, here's words that are written. Here's what I meant when I wrote this. And then that continues down history. Now then, of course, that changes from here's what I meant when I wrote this to here's what I was told this writing meant, right? Because the verbal's getting passed down along with the written. Today, it is that interpretation of the written word that is causing all sorts of splintering amongst the various Protestant groups. By some counts, there are thousands, but let's say like there's just only hundreds of different Protestant denominations. That's still a splintering that I don't think the apostles ever intended, that Jesus definitely didn't intend, and that we need to try to fix, I think. The best way to fix it is for, hopefully, everybody to go ahead and try to find the original church. I think I've mentioned previously that I was once told that, oh yeah, having all these different denominations is good. That way you can find the denomination that believes pretty much the way you do. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but that's the pathway to hell, right? You don't try to find the church that believes the way you do. You try to find the church who believes the truth, who's passing on the truth. And the best way to know the truth is to go all the way back to the beginning and see what those individuals believed, right? And how they passed it down. So we have the Bible that was collected. And don't forget, it wasn't actually collected in the format that we have until like the 400s or so. So even the early writers, they have access to various epistles, they have access to the Gospels, and many of them are in very educated areas, and they may actually have access to almost everything that we've got. But at the same time, they're still writing, the majority of people, I should say, have limited access to a lot of what we consider the Bible. So these individuals' writings, also combined with what can be passed down verbally, are extremely important. And so they're writing about those, and that's what we're trying to get insight into. So there I was deciding that I needed to get a better handle on the early church. So I hopped in and I started reading, because I had heard of him, Justin Martyr. He's got several things that he's written that we have access to today, and I started in on what's called his first apology. And then I read his second apology. And just like our apologetics today, it's just him kind of defending Christianity. And in this case, he was defending Christianity to the emperor. But so in his first and second apology, he lists or talks about various things within the church. And so this gets me to my first issue, which is the Eucharist. So when I started looking at Orthodoxy, the Eucharist, which many of the Protestant denominations call communion, the Orthodox believe that it is truly the flesh and blood of Christ. And I was raised that that's not what it was, right? It was just a symbol or a remembrance of that. And I think I may talk a little more about some of the individuals in the Reformation in my next one, because that idea, what's called the magisterial reformers, such as Luther and Calvin, and they move a little bit away from the actual flesh and blood, or they play with the wording a little bit. But it's really not until you get to an individual by the name of Zwingli, who is really a rabid change artist, and changes all sorts of things. And a lot of his ideas have moved into particularly American Christianity. And he was so off his rocker that Luther was not a fan of him, right? And Luther's the one that put up the 95 Theses to get things going. But I don't want to go too far down that road. I'll talk about that next time. Suffice to say, I was taught that the Eucharist was just a symbol or a remembrance of what Christ had done for us. And yet you start reading in the early church, Justin's first apology, he talks about it's the actual flesh and blood of Christ. I was like, conveniently, for me, that seemed pretty easy. I don't know why, but I read it by Justin. I believe that it was a very important remembrance. And so when Justin is sitting here going, oh, well, it's actually the actual flesh and blood, I'm like, oh, must be the actual flesh and blood of Christ. Don't know how it happens. Don't really need to contemplate that one, but there it is. However, change of one's belief should not be based on one man's opinion, right? So I go ahead and I continue reading. I get into the letters of St. Ignatius. In there, he talks about this one group is a group of heretics. Why? Because they don't believe it's the actual flesh and blood of Christ. Later on, I get to reading, and I'm in Irenaeus's Against Heresies. And Irenaeus says it's the flesh and blood of Christ. So as I've continued to read a lot of this older stuff, anytime it is mentioned, it seems to be pretty ubiquitous that the Eucharist is the flesh and blood of Christ. What I don't see and what I haven't found is anybody in the early church who disagrees with this thought. And therefore, I'm solidly on board with the Eucharist is the taking of the actual flesh and blood of Christ, which then goes ahead and provides God's grace or his power to the members of the church to help us grow and to become more like him. The bishop-priest issue, however, was very different for me. So somewhere along the lines, I picked up the idea that the bishops and priests were a change to the church that was made by the Roman Church. And so, I was taught that basically the Roman Church is bad, and so this is one of those innovations that they kicked off. And so bishops and priests were bad, not supposed to have those, and that's pretty much how I had lived my Protestant life, from my General Baptist church all the way up to these Southern Baptist churches. No one ever challenged that. As a matter of fact, it was constantly reinforced, it seemed like, that bishops, priests are bad. It was an innovation of the Roman Church. Like I said, you start reading some of that early stuff. And just as a reference, so Justin Martyr in his first apology and second apology, we're looking about 160 AD. Irenaeus, when he's writing, I think he's closer to about 185, pushing up towards 200 AD. I mentioned St. Ignatius. He was made a bishop in 68 AD, but he wrote his letters as he's being shipped off to Rome to be torn apart by wild animals. And so that's probably closer to the turn of the century. So he wrote his letters right around 100 AD, even though he had been ordained a bishop about 30 years earlier. And then First Clement's another one that I was reading, that in order to get that early church layout and such. And so he's writing somewhere between 85 and 100 AD, and to the best of my memory, he's made a bishop there in Rome right around 88 AD. So, and I just throw all those dates out so that you know these are early writers, right? And both Clement, his epistle called First Clement is written to the Corinthians, and it is getting on to the Corinthians because they have overthrown their priests for whatever reason. And he's talking about how wrong they are, that the church has approved those, okay? Not their congregation, but that the church. Now then, when you go ahead and you're reading St. Ignatius, essentially St. Ignatius ties the bishops to the church, right? So where the bishops are, the church is. And so they are the apostles' representative passed down from Jesus. So they are Jesus's representative here with us, and they're managing the church. And so priests and other bishops are selected by the bishops. In a couple instances, either civil authorities in a given area can submit someone as, hey, we'd like to have this guy as our bishop here, or something like that. But it's actually a group of bishops coming together who actually make that selection. And so when Clement is talking about to the Corinthians that the church has approved of these priests, I think it's pretty evident, when you, particularly after you read St. Ignatius, that what he's saying is, the bishops have chosen these priests as a church. And so it's not for you all as individuals hanging out down there in your local area to just throw the priests out and start listening to somebody else, particularly someone who's not approved. And they do that so that you know that the individuals that you have are supposed to be tied in with and supported by the rest of the church, so that they're giving you the truth. Okay, that's what we're all trying to get at, right? So those two, St. Ignatius and First Clement, really emphasize the importance of the bishops and the priests. As I mentioned, First Clement's talking to the Corinthians that, hey, you can't be doing this with these priests. And St. Ignatius doesn't mince words. He is all about the importance of the bishop, for sure, and then the priest basically being an extension of the bishop to do those things that he can't be at because of time and space, right? So anyway, Between those two, very sure that bishops and priests are a thing. And so I'm like, wow. I actually got mad because I was like, wow, I've been taught all my life that this was a creation of the Roman Church. But it's been part of the church from the very beginning. And so I was extremely angry at first until I sat down and I started thinking about it more. And I was like, I'm willing to bet that most of the people, if not all the people, who led me to believe that this was just an innovation of Rome or just an innovation of man, that they just didn't understand the original church. They were unaware. They were ignorant, just like I was ignorant, and they were passing on their ignorance. And I don't say that to be a mean word. It's just that's the word that actually gets at the situation that we were in. We were unaware of information, and yet we were sharing information thinking that we knew what we were talking about. Another argument that I've run across was that bishops and priests are not part of the original intent of the apostles or of Jesus. It was a creation of man to gain power and prestige. So I have a little bit of an argument against that one. I thought about that one for a while. I was like, I guess that's possible. But at the same time, we have bishops going back to each of the apostles, right? All the old churches and such trace their bishoprics, would that be the right word? But all their bishops back to the apostles. And so, say like with St. Ignatius, he's coming out of Antioch. So it was St. Peter, listed as first bishop. Second bishop is, can't remember the guy's name. Not important, but there was another bishop after him. And then you roll into St. Ignatius as the third one. And obviously, he was put in place very early. There are places in the Bible where in Acts they're installing, whether it's presbyteros or overseers, right? Episcopos, which is your bishops or your priests. They're installing those in other locations in Acts. And in Titus, in the book of Titus, Paul is specifically telling them, or telling Titus, do this, which is to appoint elders or priests and bishops in this area of these churches. So he's setting up these churches. He's supposed to be appointing the leadership of these churches. And it's Paul who's telling him to do so. So again, not only do you see them setting it up, but you also see the managerial structure in how they operate, right? So the apostles have the ultimate authority right now. And then they're setting up these bishops and priests. And for the most part, it seems like in the early church that bishop-priest was almost interchangeable, right? And you can see this with some individuals who end up getting made a bishop of a location that has like 12 people. But as the need for the management grows and the fact that a bishop ends up with far more than just 12 people and he needs somebody to help him organize and manage what's going on, then the titles seem to have taken on more of an actual hierarchical nature, right? So that the bishops are setting up the priests go ahead and dole things out to the people. But where I'm going with that is that this structure seems to have been in place in the Bible. It was obviously in place by the time I'm reading those early books, First Clement and St. Ignatius. And what's very interesting about the fact that St. Ignatius and St. Clement are writing these books is that they're writing them before all the apostles have passed away. Because that's one of the things that I was told also was that, well, this was a man-made thing and that went off the rails after the apostles were gone. But John's still running around, right? Like I said, even in the 90s when St. Ignatius is writing his letter, and he's been a bishop since 68, Clement since 88. Well, John is free to roam about, it seems like, until the early 90s, or right around 95 AD. And then he finally dies in 98. And of course, he writes the book of Revelation in that later period, in those in the 90s. So he's around. He's aware of this setup that's going on. If for some reason it wasn't something that was meant by the apostles, because of the authority the apostles had, he could shut the whole thing down. He didn't. If it seemed like it was, you don't really have a political movement to drive this, because it's not actually legal at the time, right? They're dealing with the Jews, and they have to, just like with Justin's apology, first and second apology that he's got going to the emperors, a lot of things are just blamed on the Christians because they're different. And so, it's not like they're tied with any sort of political organization that they're trying to emulate. Really what it seems like is that since they're coming out of the Jewish structure, right, early on, they don't see themselves as separate. They see themselves as fulfilling the Jewish law, right? The Messiah has actually come. And so early on, the Christians see themselves as Jews who are now following the Messiah. And essentially when they get disowned by the Jews is when you start getting a clean break, and you start seeing, some really clear-cut differences between them. But so they're bringing that same level of structure, if you will. So, but primarily I see it in the apostles, and the fact that John doesn't go ahead and tear it down before he passes away. And we know that he still got it mentally, because again, he writes the book of Revelation very late before he dies. So he was in a position he could have fixed anything he thought was wrong with the structure. He doesn't. So we see the structure getting set up in the Bible. We see the structure in the early writings. We know that that John was alive, and he doesn't naysay it. He doesn't try to fix it. He doesn't, declare it wrong. And all those things taken together, I think, says that bishops and priests were how the apostles intended to set this thing up, and it's how the early church was set up, and it's how we should be set up today. And then getting back to the Eucharist, again, it's ubiquitous across all the writers. Not until like the 16th century, so 1500s, when Zwingli hops in there, do you actually have any significant movement to go ahead and say that it is not the actual body and blood of Christ. And when you read early church writings, even from the individuals who go and get called heretical at some point, such as Origen and others like him, there's no talk about it not being the body and blood of Christ. It was seen as the body and blood of Christ by the early church, and therefore it should be taken as the actual body and blood of Christ by us today. So that's my whole goal with these. I think I mentioned it at the beginning, but I'm going to mention it again, is to look at, I started looking at a whole lot of early writings as I went through, as I started questioning some of the things as a Baptist. And I want to get back to the original church. So I want to share all the stuff that I find that I believe is part of what the original church was. And these two things, the Eucharist being the actual body and blood, and the structure being that of bishops and priests, are a part of the early church. So next time, I'll go ahead and mention exactly what it's going to be, but I'm going to touch on either how baptism is actually effectual, or I may go into a little more history into the 16th century with how I think individuals, particularly like Zwingli, really set forth some ideas that are counter to what the early church was doing, but that we picked up, particularly here in America and somewhat in Western Europe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great time. God bless.